Perfect. So just a little bit of housekeeping, just a second. Just a moment of housekeeping. We'll make sure that we do that follow-up email. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat. We'll have time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. But today we're going to be doing one of my favorite trainings. I love to garden, and that's what we're going to be talking about, that interplay between gardening and mental health. So some of the things we're just going to quickly look at are the statistics around gardening and mental health and kind of the shift and changes that have been occurring over the past 3 years. We'll look at the positives, the things you gain and learn as you work in the garden, but also different types of gardens. I know some people will say, I would love to be a gardener, but I have a black thumb, and I would say there's probably a couple of reasons for that. And I firmly believe that when you kind of have a little bit more information and then intentionality between your plant selections and the space that you'll be growing in, you'll have way more success. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Also, we'll talk about how to make sure that the ones that you're selecting fit your lifestyle, and then do a quick breeze through some community resources. As with all of our trainings, we start with quotes because we love them. And I think that when we talk about gardening, we always want to talk about people that inspire us, that motivate us, that really kind of bring us an awareness into why we do the things that we do and why we love it so much. So one of my garden mentors over the last few years has been Ron Finley, and he says, once you get in the garden, you realize that almost everything is possible. And he's a fantastic urban gardener. When we look at some of the classical ideas around gardening, we look at this definition and it says it's ornamental grounds laid out for public enjoyment and recreation. But the idea of it being ornamental instead of functional, instead of producing food for us to eat, has really shifted and changed it over the last few years. When we look at, just move these controls. When we look kind of at what a typical gardener looks like, what we saw was that 79% were college or graduate, some college level, and that most people were 45 and older, and a little bit over half was female. But that's been kind of slowly shifting and changing, and we'll talk about why that's happened and what that looks like now. But some of the most popular things to grow, I mean, if you're a gardener, tomatoes. We love to grow tomatoes. They're easy to grow, and it's just such a nice high yield plant that if you have a sunny space, most gardeners will have this in their garden, quickly followed up by cucumbers and sweet peppers. So you see people are really wanting to get a good yield with an easy plant. People spend on average, which I think this is surprising for people who aren't as much into gardening, that we're only spending about 5 hours in gardening. There are some of us that go above the average, but in general, when you have your garden set up, it is about 5 hours. So considering you have a 600-foot garden, the idea here is that your return on that space would be about $600, and you're going to spend about 70 in its setup, which means that for that 600-foot garden, you're going to get a food return of about $530. So you can see, especially with the prices of certain things increasing, why home gardens have really kind of sprung into popularity, expanded its reach into even things like apartment growing. And people are still talking about it like, do I want to pay that much or do I want to grow that much? I think that's a good conversation to be had. When we start talking about COVID-19 and gardening, I do think it's important to say that the shift has been happening around what the gardeners appear to be, right? That there has been a massive increase in people's interest in it. For example, there was about a 42% increase in gardening during the pandemic, that a vast majority of them said that they were going to either increase or maintain that activity. And that was in 2021, and that they really kind of foresaw the future of them continuing in that gardening space. And we saw that people who had children who maybe were in an apartment or just a smaller space were gardening more. We had more gardeners of color, and we definitely had younger gardeners. And so that's a wonderful thing to be able to continue to kind of share this legacy around gardening. How did MHAH kind of get involved? Because I do get this question a lot, like, what is the interplay with gardening and mental health? And I would say there's so many benefits. We don't do as much research. I think we're starting to, but we don't do as much research as some of the other countries do, especially when you look at the UK and when you look at Japan. They've done a lot of research over the decades. But we know in general that gardening and mental health, there's this aspect where it definitely helps improve your mood. It helps improve self-esteem because you're working, getting mastery, gaining skill, and you're having to really attend. So it's going to increase that attention span. It's a form of exercise. So you get all the benefits that mild to moderate exercise can give you. And for those of you who garden with a neighbor, who have community gardens, they can absolutely provide social bonds. We even have these things called free stores. I was literally talking about this last night, where gardeners will have different spaces around the state that you can go to drop off plants, pick up seeds. It's just a share space. And so you can start to see how they have that nice social bonding around an activity that they really enjoy. We're going to watch just a short video on gardening and mental health, and in particular, kind of the ways that people were approaching it during the pandemic and the quarantine, and why it became such a popular thing.
I turn to the science of happiness and I say, find people to connect to, be with people you like, get out and laugh and hug and dance and be social, engage in the arts.
Everything you said is like a list of all the things we can't do right now.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Claire, and I'm doing my own audio check. 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3. I've been working from home a lot more these days, and I'm having a hard time. I want to be clear that I'm really grateful to have a job, but I've been feeling anxious and disconnected from the outside world. Sometimes I get so restless I can't concentrate. I get overwhelmed by all the negative news and have been drinking more coffee to get through the day. And then I can't sleep well. It's becoming clear that this way of life is not going to abruptly end, so I'm realizing I need a mental shift in the way I'm approaching my daily rhythms. One of the things I found most helpful is taking daily walks around my neighborhood and identifying the plants I see. Sometimes even doing this for 15 minutes will feel like a reset on a bad day. So I've been wondering, what's the deal with plants? What's going on in my body, and why do I feel so much better when I'm around them?
Guess what? Being in a garden helps your immune system, period. Our culture tends to think of like the only way to change your neurophysiology is through pharmaceuticals. This science really speaks to how powerful this stuff is for your body.
Nature helps with, I call it the hamster wheel of rumination. So when your brain decides, oh, there's this terrible thing that could happen, and then it just replays that possibility over and over in your head. That's something that nature actually has proven effects in helping us get away from ruminating.
In 2015, researchers from Stanford studied the neural activity of people who had been on a 90-minute nature walk versus people who had been on an urban walk, and found that those who walked through nature had decreased activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain associated with anxiety and rumination.
Even these little bits of nature that are right outside our window can make a real difference. So we see heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down, adrenaline levels change, your cortisol levels change. Just playing with soil for 5 minutes, we can actually see your parasympathetic nervous activation change from fight or flight, moving towards tend and befriend.
It seems like this might be a good time for me to start my first garden. I live in a small apartment with limited outdoor space, so I think I'm gonna need some professional advice.
Am I not on video? Oh, there I am. There we go. Hi.
Hi.
I specialize in small space biointensive gardening methods because of having started in an apartment.
Just what are your most basic tips, the minimum things that you need to get started?
First, start small. Really just pick 1 or 2 things to grow to start with, like herbs or a tomato plant. And you want a good container that has good drainage, and you want the best quality soil you can get.
So I headed to a nursery and bought some plants for a modest garden on my rooftop. Really hard to smell with the mask on.
Oh, you can smell it though. It smells really good.
We are human beings On the planet Earth, we are part of nature. We're missing so much because we've got the floor and we wear shoes and we have walls and a roof over our head, and it detaches us from nature. The more we get our hands in the dirt and sit out in the sun and smell the flowers and watch the butterflies, the better everything is.
While it's clear nature has profound impacts on our physical and mental health, scientists debate why exactly it is that nature is so effective at getting us out of rumination. Dr. Keltner says it has something to do with the emotion of awe.
Awe is when you encounter vast things that are beyond your immediate frame of reference, that are mysterious in the sense that your current knowledge doesn't allow you to understand them. That changes your sense of self. And awe stimulates the imagination. And that's what we call wonder, which is, wow, how will I figure this out?
This all sounds really great, but I can't exactly go to the Grand Canyon when I'm being advised to stay home as much as possible. So what are ways that I can cultivate awe now?
Slow down, breathe while you walk. Take a moment to study leaves and flowers and plants. Thousands of years ago, as we lived with nature, we became these scientists of nature. We recognized all the ecosystems and the complex processes.
Studies have demonstrated that these kinds of complex patterns we see in nature, this symmetry and fractals, actually reduce stress. Dr. Keltner thinks one of the reasons they might do this is because they illustrate the idea of being part of a whole. They help us direct our attention outward and think about how we fit into the larger patterns of life around us.
So this is it, my first ever very humble little garden, and I think it looks really good.
Suddenly mind is connected to that, right? And you're like, whoa, I'm bigger, or I'm part of this expanse.
Obviously, gardening hasn't gotten rid of all my stress and anxiety, but this process has given me some perspective. When I'm feeling stuck in one place or overwhelmed by things outside my control, refocusing my attention to the plants in my neighborhood or my own little vegetables reminds me that I'm intrinsically a part of a larger process of growth and transformation. And even if that's happening in a small space, like the corner of my rooftop, it's incredible.
You can see that a lot of people gained some interest in doing some gardening. Maybe it was their first time gardens during that time. And there are a lot of benefits around that. Some people refer to as green therapy or green care, but there have been studies that have shown, for example, in Japan, that just viewing plants through EEG readings they found could reduce stress, fear, anger, and sadness. That there have been other studies that talk about when someone has gone through an operation, that their post-op kind of complications and length of stay are actually shorter because they're able to kind of see that green space and get that really big benefit. We know that basic indoor plants are some that have been really highlighted as great toxin reducers, but also the idea that when we kind of go out into the garden, we get that nice kind of return in vitamin D, that light exercise, and we also get all the benefits around dexterity and strength when we work in the garden. If you are a gardener, you know that's true because you do a lot of light to moderate exercise, and it can really help you kind of just take a step away from the busyness of the day. There's a lot of different types of garden, and I think that it's really important to kind of highlight that because the question becomes what's your best fit for a garden? So some specific types are community gardens. This is where possibly you are able to get a space. You sign up for it, you get your space, and there are other people with lots or allotments around you that are able to garden. And I've been and visited several of these, and they're fantastic. People keep them for years, and sometimes if they're available for decades, and they really do a lot of cross share of grown produce. You have herb gardens, which can be as extensive or small as you want. Anything that's indoor gardens, kitchen gardens, things grown specifically just for your use in the kitchen when making food. Sensory gardens, which we'll go into in just a few minutes, which is basically about the engagement of your senses Cut flower gardens, you just grow those plants specifically for making cuttings and doing arrangements or doing different art forms with it. Cactus gardens, water gardens, victory gardens are more kind of historical, but it's the idea of producing enough food for your household. So very similar to our kitchen gardens. And then even things like the poison garden, which is actually one of my favorites, and I like to visit them when I go on vacations. And we'll talk about that. So interestingly, this is where we also start to talk a little bit about plant safety. So to make sure that when you're looking at starting a garden, even well, more especially as well, if you're doing an indoor garden, it's about being mindful of plant selection. So these are a couple of the plants that you'll find in poison gardens, which some of them can be surprising. So for example, black walnut, buttercups, caladiums, daffodils, hydrangeas, mistletoe, monkshood and nicotiana. Several of these I definitely have grown or currently have in my gardens. I literally have some of this in my office sometimes. And I think people are a little bit surprised about the fact that, caladiums or daffodils would be on here. But the reality is, oftentimes when people are selecting indoor plants, they're selecting from plants that are able to kind of tolerate temperate environments. And so that's typically our like jungle friends who like a little bit of humidity, but do really well in that kind of like stable 70-degree weather without having that cold start. And the reason that's important to know is because that means we have to be really careful if we have children, if we have pets, to make sure that we're placing them or just not selecting them so that it's safe. When I went to visit this poison garden, which is actually in Ireland, at a castle, it was really interesting because when we talked to the gardener, they would say like the reason I think people have historically been fascinated by these gardens is because they're often plants they see in their own gardens and they're surprised to find them here. But there's also a tiny line between medicinal and toxic, and it's just about dosing. And so you'll see a lot of things that are actually the beginnings of medicine, and medicine is born from them in these types of gardens. So really kind of fascinating things here. But to think about when you're selecting plants, that you do a little bit of that back research to make sure, is this safe for me? Is this safe for my home? And who lives in it? Talking about sensory gardens, I think this is a fantastic one, especially if you have keiki or you're someone who like really has to manage around their anxiety or stress. A sensory garden can be just a delight. And the reason why is that every plant is really well selected to engage one of the senses. So for example, if you were thinking about just the sense of sight, that you would be thinking about using bright colors, or some people prefer to have like soft colors. So it's the idea of jewel tones versus pastels. And here's where we talk about things like maybe sunflowers or zinnias, marigolds or snapdragons, lobelia, dianthus, or geraniums. Like what type of color would you like in your garden? I myself kind of typically prefer a riot. It's the only way to describe it, a riot of color. So there's always a blend of things going on. I want it to be really visually appealing. The other sense you can think about is smell. What smells amazing? And typically we do think about the herbs when we think about that area. So it's basil, lavender, sage, thyme, lemongrass, oregano, curry. And one I recently picked up and added to my garden is the cola plant. It was really fun because when you smell it, it smells actually like soda. And so that was a really fun one for me to find and add in. Touch is also one that can be fantastic. I think a lot of times we're looking for things that are fuzzy or that just like feel really smooth and nice. And you can get all kinds of different textures. Straw flowers, celosia, those are well known for being kind of a nice texture. But the big one everyone loses in their garden. I say loses because little hands will take the leaves, is Stachys byzantina, also known as lamb's ear. It is a beautiful white color. Dusty Miller kind of looks similar to that. And it's really soft like velvet, and that one often gets pulled and taken. So if you grow it, grow abundance of it because people are going to want it. But some of the herbs also have that feel to it. So sage, one that I really enjoy is lemon balm mandarina, has also that really soft one. And then when you rub it, it smells like oranges and lemons. So that's a wonderful one to kind of add to your garden. But you can also do different grasses to kind of run your hand through, or things like oregano, which also have a Cuban version of it that smells really wonderful, but also the leaves are very soft. So intentional plant selection can give you multiple things because people are sometimes surprised to find that they come in different varieties. So for example, I like to grow this really dark purple basil that is beautiful when it flowers. It looks wonderful. The color is amazing. So I get a lot of return for having that just in the back of the beds. Things to think about. And then with sounds, you can choose things like grasses. If you have a very large garden and you're able to have trees, that sound of the wind moving through the leaves. You can add bamboo in small containers, gourds. Love in the Mist is a very particular plant where when it dries out, the seed pods make sounds. We actually added in wind chimes, so we get a little bit more of that sound piece. And then for other people, they add a water feature, like a little mini pond to put in their water garden with a little bit of a solar piece that like bubbles out. It's about thinking about the size of your garden and also how you want to use your garden. That can be really helpful. For some people, they also think about things like indigenous healing gardens, medicinal plant gardens, and those can also cross over. So for example, if we're talking about a medicinal garden, you see that these are common herbs that we find: coriander, basil, rosemary, dill, that are often used in kind of like home remedies. So thinking about what is it that you're looking to grow, what is the purpose of your garden, and which plants are the best selection for that, because you can have a lot, but it's all about the maintenance. I've definitely gotten plant happy and had to stretch that muscle. We talked a little bit about the fact that gardeners, the kind of view and landscape of who's getting involved in gardening has changed. And I think it's really fun to look at the different people who are really actively gardening today and how you can find people that are big mentors, motivations, just people that are like in alignment with what you're looking for. And these are two examples that I always like to share. The one on the left goes by the Instagram handle of Spicy Mustache, and he is spicy. He's all about that kind of zero waste, natural remedy, foraging, like how to use what you have to the biggest and most of its ability. And so we'll watch just a short reel on that.
3 medicinal flowers that you can grow in your garden. Calendula. Calendula holds powerful healing effects. You can dry the flowers and make your own skin salve that has strong anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial benefits. Lavender. Lavender is the holy grail of stress relief. Infuse the petals in oil to aid in headaches, anxiety, and better sleep. Nasturtium. Nasturtiums are jam-packed with antioxidants, vitamin C, and iron. Every part of the plant is edible with potent anti-inflammatory properties.
And then we have Black Forager. She's a BIPOC forager that's really well known for bringing in kind of the historical aspects of plants and their uses, and maybe why those were lost along the way. And she's really big into vegan recipes. So she's also an interesting person to follow and watch.
It's springtime, and for me, that means getting to get back to foraging. Let me show you every edible plant growing in my front yard right now. Dandelion, edible. Red nettle, edible. And in the mint family, daylily shoots, edible, but leave some so they can flower. Gallium, also known as sticky weed, edible. And slightly caffeinated from being in the coffee family. Grape hyacinth, edible, but only the flowers, which is fine because they're the cutest part. Field garlic, edible. Forsythias, edible. This spring, you should go and find out what's edible in your yard. Happy snacking. Don't die.
So I think that's a really great reminder that if you're wanting to get into foraging, you really need to work with people who are absolute experts in the field, because plants can often mimic each other. So one thing that is really safe to eat, easily accessible, could really look very similar to something that was unsafe to eat. So the Black Forager always says, happy snacking, don't die, please work with an expert. And if that's something you're interested in, there's a lot of people who do that. I've had foraging classes here in Hawaii, so there are people who are doing it here and sharing that wisdom with other people. One of the complaints I think I sometimes hear, they're like, oh, this is great, Dr. G, but I don't have any space. And I would say, think about the space that you have that's a possibility. If you look straight down the middle, these are all spaces that I currently or have used. So if you look down the middle, I actually am a renter. And so my landlords had this space, that's that top tile, that top picture, that wasn't being used. And so we would walk by and see it. And so one day I was like, do you mind if we like build a garden? And they said, oh, that'd be great. Do something with it. And so I ended up deciding I'm just going to plant everything I've ever wanted to grow in the space. So I used it more of a cut flower space. And that's that middle picture. We got that bed cleared out. We just kind of lined it with all these beautiful plants that we ever wanted to grow. And then a few, like, I think it was like 2 months later, that's that bottom picture with everything in full bloom. And it's definitely a mix of herbs and different types of flowers. We go through different rounds of using different plants. And this is still a bed that we continue to kind of update and add things into. So that was a really nice thing to be able to add. On the far left with the different pots, that's actually a staircase that we have at our house that was just kind of a really steep one. And it just seemed like empty space. And so as a true gardener, you go, I could do something with that. I could fill that space up. And so we decided one summer we would do every imaginable colored pot with all these wonderful plants. And so you see sunflowers and herbs. There's a Stachys byzantina kind of tucked away in that bottom brown pot. There's some lobelia caladium. So you see a lot of, there's basil there as well. And it's really about like, do I have a space that could be utilized for more than one thing? When we were doing a lot of more, working from home, and some of us were just starting to re-enter, when we were working here in the office, we decided, like, wonder what we could grow in our windowsills. And I have quite a few plants in my windowsill here, but we actually took on the task of growing miniature tomatoes. And so 2 of the staff members did that, and we would have little baby tomatoes on our desks when we had a nice little harvest. We grew herbs. It was just really quite fun to see that even one singular windowsill could really be a tiny garden if you decided to use it in that way. So think about your spaces. It can be a little bit expensive to get into gardening. I'll be the first person to be transparent about that. But there's a lot of plants that you can actually grow from food scraps. And this is an example of just a couple. So potatoes, basil, celery, onions, carrots. You can regrow full plants just from food scraps of things that you already have and that you finished using. So to think about whether that would be an opportunity for you. When we talk about gardening, part of why we are so passionate about gardening is because gardening isn't just about kind of enjoying it, looking at something lovely, smelling something wonderful. It's also about the idea of like availability of healthy food as a resource to people. There's an idea that people can sometimes live in what we call food deserts. So food deserts are basically areas where people have very limited and sometimes no access to both healthy and affordable food. That's what we define as a food desert. So we know that these food deserts disproportionately affect Black and Brown communities. The USDA said there's about 19 million residents who live in food deserts. They have more access to fast food or to alcohol than they do to healthy, affordable food. Another research was kind of looking at whether or not people were able to get to healthy food, and they found that 2.3 million people live more than 1 mile away from a supermarket, and they don't even own a car, making it really difficult for them to get access there. We also know that in areas that have higher levels of poverty, we have higher levels of food deserts. And so part of what we think about is whether or not gardening can be a revolution. It can be an act where we really help people learn about being able to make and grow their own food because they don't have access to that food, even if it's in a small way. And we talked about Ron Finley when we started the presentation, and this is just his kind of take on hyper-local food and making it available for people.
I don't want my food local. I want my food hyper-local. I'm Ron Finley. I'm an evolutionary, renegade, gangster, provocateur, game-changing gardener. Urban gardening to me is putting food in urban areas where there is none. I mean, to me, the fast foods companies are occupying these areas. I don't call them food deserts. I call them food prisons. Because you literally have to escape and break out of these situations to get anything healthy. People ask me, why did I do this? What was my inspiration? I'm like, well, cancer was my inspiration. Diabetes was my inspiration. Asthma, I was inspired. We are eating garbage. We have no skin in the game. We don't know where our food comes from, nor do we care. We go and we talk into a box, and then we drive 20 feet, and then they hand us a bag that's supposed to be food. That's all the skin in the game we have. When I first did this, it was more for beauty and smell. Lavender, jasmine, rosemary. And then I had planted banana trees for shade. I got a warrant for that. And I had to take it out. I had to go to court a couple of times. They had laws in place. And one of them included you could not put any edibles on your parkway. I didn't get any complaints when the toilets and the dressers, all the trash and the plastic was on here, but I planted a carrot in the ground and all hell broke loose. And now this is legal. Got the law changed. What we're basically doing with the Ron Finley Project, we're going to have 2 HQs. One of them's going to be here. One of them's going to be the oldest operating library in Los Angeles, and it has an acre behind it. We want to make this the most healing, sexiest garden in America. I don't even want to call it an urban community garden. I just want to turn it into like a food forest where people can engage in the community. It's so needed. There's nothing here. My thing is put it there yourself, grow it yourself. I don't want anything straight. When they do these gardens with these beds, they look like caskets to me. I want sexy. I want curves. When I walk out of my place, when I walk down the street, why can't I see beauty? Instead of concrete, asphalt. To me, the whole urban gardening thing is about art. I want everybody to be able to design their own life. And that's why I put this on the street, for people to be engaged, to be inspired. I don't grow food, I grow people. Then they grow food. It's about the experience. It's about awareness. It's about knowing where you come from. Realize that you have a choice in this. Wake up and change your life.
So I think one of the reasons I think that he kind of is really inspirational to me is this idea that when you start to kind of take back these spaces, I always walk by parkways and think, oh, what could have been planted there? When you start to take back these spaces, they actually really empower people and can give them more accessibility to all these wonderful foods. And if you think about a whole entire neighborhood street with those parkways filled with food, how much accessibility that really gives out to people, or these kind of shared public spaces, it's just wonderful. They were using that library to start to create that garden, but it really starts to create those community connections, and it really starts to kind of bring down the impact those food deserts have in communities. Gardening is not just about advocacy. It's not just about those types of things. It can also be about art and creativity. We know that for some people, they enjoy kind of enhancing that kind of creative artistic aspect in their life through gardening. There's a type of art called Ikebana. A particular version of that is Sugetsu Ikebana that I have had the honor of being, taught in for several years. And what we do is the idea of taking cuttings of plants and to acknowledge the fact that the plant will never be beautiful now that you've pulled it out of nature if you try to replicate that nature, but instead to look at it in a different way, to find these kind of creative plantings, these unusual ways of representing them, and to be able to do that to create something even more like intriguing or interesting. And these are just 2 of the arrangements that I have done using different cuttings from my own garden. And I think that it also teaches us that when we start to learn something, that sometimes what we find is that we're not great at it right off the get, and that's okay. But what happens is when we take risks, when we're okay with not being great at it, with failing to some degree as we go through the learning process, that it allows us to have more freedom, where wonderful things can happen. Part of the learning process is just being aware of the fact that we're not going to succeed most of the time until we get to a place of mastery. And then we still take those risks. We still do some daring things just to see the outcome, just to learn throughout the creative process. So for some people, gardening can also be a creative outlet. You can do things like palm weaving. You can dye cloth with the sun and this really particular type of dye that's really fun to do. Also taking clippings from your garden. But the idea here is make it work for you, make it easy. We talk about all these wonderful ideas, and there's probably at least one of you thinking, these are great, Dr. G, but right, like I haven't had a lot of success. And I would say the more you educate yourself on it, the easier it becomes. So there's this kind of concept in gardening that's called companion planting. And I'd like to do it particularly with my tomatoes. And the idea is that when you plant certain plants together, it makes it easier to grow them both. when we grow marigolds, I put them in with my tomatoes because they are a natural repellent for some of the insects that typically bother my tomatoes. I don't have to do anything else but just add flowers into my tomato beds, and then I get way more protection from some of those unfortunate creepy crawlies that I don't like. There's even different watering systems. So Oyas are kind of historical way of approaching gardens, and it's really about putting a terracotta vessel into the ground, and then you fill it with water, and it slowly evaporates, releases into the soil over a couple of days depending upon how large your Oya is, and it helps to water it when you yourself might forget for the day or two. I have them in my cut flower garden. They were hard to find to be able to ship in because they're terracotta, they break easily, so I just made my own using some of the supplies we had around and buying a terracotta pot. Very easy to find directions on how to make your own, but to think about how can I save time? How can I save energy and effort just by doing a little bit of research early on? And gardening doesn't have to be big. Enjoying plants could be actually quite small. So you could do cut eucalyptus in your showers. You could do air plants in a really nice space. They require very little. You don't even have to use soil, and you could just mist them like once a week and they will be happy as can be. And you can also do a little bowl of succulents. They typically like a little bit more sun and a little less water. And so if you're someone who's like, that sounds like something I could do, they could be a good fit. There's a lot of lessons that we learn in the garden. I would say one of the things to highlight is that for some people, it really is about taking the time to understand what type of gardener you are. Are you someone who's a heavy waterer? Or are you someone who kind of forgets to water? Right. And it's okay. It's okay if you just honestly say, yeah, I forgot about that one plant. And then like 4 weeks later, I discovered it. That tells me like cacti might be a good fit for you if you have enough sun, right? Don't work against yourself by picking ferns if you have high light and low watering capacity. Pick something that fits for you. If you happen to have a lot of shade and you're a heavy waterer, a fern would be a great pick. So again, think about who you are, how you take care of plants, and what is a good fit for you. I myself have had plants that I have been fully convinced I'm going to be fantastic at growing them and have never, ever succeeded. Right? Sometimes it's about the radical acceptance. These are things we learn from our garden, to accept the fact that it is what it is. I could try to battle my natural environment to grow things that don't want to grow there, or I could just radically accept this is kind of the place I'm at. This is the natural kind of growth cycle, amount of water we get, and to actually be very mindful about picking things that like that space instead of choosing things I have to constantly work to even keep alive. Radical acceptance. It is what it is. Let me let go of things that are uncontrollable and focus on the things that are. Being very present focused, I think, is really important, because what you find out is that it's ever changing in the garden, and some days it's beautiful and some days you're like, it's a little scant, I need to add something, but you're constantly just enjoying it in the moment. And to know that mistakes happen, that you could do everything right and it just still not go well for you. I remember one Yule, one kind of December, I decided to do an entire stairwell full of poinsettias. I was like so excited. I did them all, and they did not one of them like the space. Not one of them. And so months later, I was like, they still don't like it. They had grown maybe 2 inches. The poor things just kept straggling along, and it just petered out by the time we got close to summer. And it was me going, I just didn't pick the right plant to like that kind of a space. And that's okay. Mistakes happen and we learn. We won't be doing those stairs again. But it's also important to think about just being patient, especially if you go through the seeding process. I think that if you work with children and you want children to garden with you, it's very important to think about they like a quick return. They're not going to be as patient as you. So if it's going to take 4 weeks to germinate something, or it needs a cold start, they're not going to enjoy that. I highly recommend things like zinnias. They will pop up within less than a week and they will sprout very quickly, and the kids will be able to enjoy the fact that they're growing so well and so fast, and they do really well here. But be patient and just know that growing takes time, that we get that really beautiful moment of abundance and harvest only after doing all that early work. And you can kind of see how these are all also mental health lessons. We talk about the fact that we have to be very present focused. And I think that we also have to leave space for pleasant surprises. This kind of takes me to the story of the prickly poppy, because this is one that happened to me in my garden. I had an empty container, it just had soil in it. And I thought, wouldn't that be a beautiful place to put flowers? And then this odd plant popped up, one that I had not put there. And if you have a garden, you know that sometimes happens and you're like, what is this? What is growing here? And I remember talking to people about the idea that sometimes you get these pleasant surprises, and instead of just dumping it out like I was kind of feeling the need to do, I just kind of let it happen. It was such an odd looking plant. I just kind of wanted to see where it went. And then as it continued to grow, it had these beautiful white flowers, and we started to realize this is actually like a really big gift for our garden. It was an indigenous prickly poppy that some bird had bequeathed us that had flown over our garden, and we let it grow into its full beauty, and we actually collected seeds at the end of its growth period so we could plant it again. We took it to one of the botanical gardens and said, hey, this is what we have in our garden, and they were really impressed by it as well. So it was truly a blessing. And that sometimes happens, this idea of, allow space for things to happen, allows space and opportunity for these things that happen in your garden to kind of take hold and for you to enjoy the moment. And I think that's the present focus portion of it as well. When you're thinking about getting more active in your garden, I think it's really nice to find people who've kind of, trailblazed the way. So if you're really wanting to learn more about urban gardening, to find someone who's really passionate about advocating and planting and doing similar programming that you might be interested in. So one of my urban gardener favorites is Ron Finley. I also love really overly formalized gardens. I know it's a big dichotomy there, but Monty Don is this amazing British horticulturist who has a massive garden with every imaginable thing in it, and it's part of Gardener's World, which is a gardening show on TV. And so I like to watch kind of both ends. And then there's also kind of this new social media darling, Kevin Espiritu, who decided I'm going to get into gardening and I don't know a lot about it, and you get to follow along on his journey. He by recently, I mean about 2 years ago-ish, bought a house and was like, I'm going to make this my ultimate urban garden. I'll see how I do, because he was learning as he went. And you kind of get to learn the same mistakes and kind of lessons learned as he does. And so that's really fun. But think about who's going to inspire you, who's going to motivate you, what kind of gardener do you want to be, and does it fit your lifestyle, and does it fit what you're looking for to get back out of your garden? As with all of our trainings, we'll make sure that we provide you with crisis resources so that if you need them in the community, they are there. But there's also some fantastical resources. If you're wanting to learn more about gardening, I would say to kind of contact our urban gardeners, look at our botanical gardens, and kind of reach out. I do know that there's possibility for some community garden spaces that are popping up. So I definitely look at the botanical gardens in your area to reach out and say, hey, this is what I'm interested in learning about. Is there some connections? There's often also plant sales that kind of happen around the island. And when you get there, you'll see some of our universities, some of our other programming, whether that's CTAR. There's just so many people that are involved in those different programs. And oftentimes they're my plant buddies, and they will give me really fun plants to try at home. So I highly recommend kind of getting out there and doing a little bit of discovery with that. If you have any questions about some of the content we talked about today, feel free to reach out to our office. That first number is our Oahu office, and the second is for Maui County. We do have free screenings available if you're wanting to take some. That does include sleep, anxiety, depression, all those different types of things that people may be experiencing, but go to the bit.ly or the QR code and you'll be able to access that. It's anonymous, it's free, and it's available for everyone. I'm going to stop sharing just a moment to drop a couple of things into our chat. We do have a survey that we have people kind of take, and if you're interested, it's a great place to give us feedback about our trainings, but also to let us know what you're looking for if you haven't seen it yet. We also have a finding help directory for low-fee, no-fee services around the state for mental health and other types of services. And then we have our 2023 training brochure. So if you're interested in any of the trainings that you've seen us do, and you're thinking that could be a fit for your organization, please feel free to reach out and let us know, and then we'll be able to support you maybe setting that up. For those of you who are like, that was great today, I would love to have a mini garden and I'm not really sure where to go. I would say to kind of do a little bit of research, and my number one recommendation is to have fun with the seeds. There are a couple of options for mini versions of things I think people are a little bit unaware of. Some of the favorites are things like this, a window box little cherry tomatoes. And so you can find mini tomatoes. You can also get things like mini cabbages, right? There's so many versions of vegetables if your space is tiny. If you're already working in a garden and you're like, I just kind of want to try some different things. There's some amazing seed companies that have heirloom plants. This is one I recently got that I cannot wait until after summer when it's really hot and dry. We're thinking September to put into my garden. This is a celosia version that actually almost went extinct. So they brought that back because they found one singular packet. If you are a well-versed gardener, you can try some of these kind of rare plants. If you're one that wants to do minis, it's there. And there's a lot of wonderful places where if you're interested in working with indigenous plants, they now offer those. I have a couple of them in my garden that I didn't even know existed, including Hawaiian celosia, which is a mint that doesn't have that really strong mint smell to it. But there are more availability now, I think, than there has ever been to have some more of those like indigenous plants and to be able to get that access to add to your garden because they're so fantastic. And I think that when we expose our children and when we expose the younger generations to these types of plants and healing properties, it can be so beneficial, especially in kind of reconnecting to their cultures. So hopefully today at the end of this presentation, you kind of walked away with either a little bit more passion for what you already do or a little bit more interest in something maybe you hadn't considered but were thinking about a little bit. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat now. We will make this recording available early next week so people can kind of look at it, review it, and have access to all the content or to share it with someone who may not have been able to come today. But we thank you so much for joining us. We've had a full week here at Mental Health America of Hawaii of trainings and of different content, including self-care, coping skills, and we rounded out with, of course, one of my favorite, which is gardening. Hopefully you're able to join us for some of those. Have a wonderful weekend. May you find time to get a little bit of sun and space with some green care. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And thank you.